Hey y'all! Welcome back to the channel and to the video I honestly didn't know until earlier today if I was going to be able to make at all. Um, Not gonna lie, this weekend got so busy I didn't end up able to watch the episode over the weekend, which is my normally preferred watching time. And then I got caught up on a personal project yesterday instead of being able to watch it. So I was afraid I was going to run into a circumstance where the best thing to do would be to do another 2-for-1 video, like I did for some of the soldiers' tables. But knowing how much Lore of the Seekers table tends to run into pretty quickly, a double-length Seekers episode breakdown would be massively long. Fortunately, I was able to find time to watch it today. So you're getting as close to like a first impressions breakdown with this one. There's been no real time for this to marinate. I did have a few hours at work after I finished the episode for some thoughts to percolate, but I'm going to be honest, I'm also working on some personal writing projects, so that was where my brain was. So a lot of these are going to be just the thoughts I jotted down as I watched the episode this week. Again, I am absolutely loving the Seekers table. To no real surprise of my own, just the mix of personalities at the table and the way I think their play style meshes with the way Brennan likes to develop and then present his world building, just is a really good fit for me as an audience member. Again, I don't know that this would be the table I would be best suited at as a player, but as an audience member, definitely the one I enjoy. And yet, when we start with the cold open, once again, we're at a different table altogether, and sort of in a mirror to last week's cold open, where we have the flashback of Hal and Thiazi. This week, we get the flashback to Bolaire's first steps into taking agency as his own entity. As we open up with the scene with the mask not yet fully considering himself a self, or certainly not being talked about, is very much being referred to as an it by the group of adventurers utilizing him. Though notably, when he does speak as the mask, he still says me, him. Like the mask still has a sense of self in terms of as an entity, but he doesn't really have a sense of self as in purpose or self desires we later see awaken through some conversation about the rebels fearing the forces of House Royce and a 14-year time gap. We are absolutely placed once again within the Falconers' Rebellion. And as the play begins and Bolaire kind of has his little existential what's going on, what is theater, I love the line, I believe it was Brennan saying about Bolaire and his siblings showing Rowan that she cannot exist, and basically not telling her that she needs to leave, but that she was never here. Which I hope we get a little bit more about that, or just, well, I kind of almost do and don't. There are some things in writing that are often best left to the audience member to fill in, because more of the fun comes from the speculation than the knowing. For those familiar with either trope talks or TV tropes, the noodle incident being the moniker for this sort of thing, where something is referenced and we learn little tidbits about it, but nothing the author could tell us would be as satisfying as the act of speculating. Obviously, you don't want to have too much of this because otherwise it's absolutely unknown. But for instance, leaving us to speculate a little bit more about what this play was and how it killed the trickster goddess, leaving that unknown while showing us why Hal's theater and theater as a concept means so much to Bolaire, in that it broke him free and allowed him to sort of start considering what he wants to do and taking his own agency. And the concept of um, theater as not necessarily relating true events, but using false stories to portray true truths. Which, again, as someone with their own background in theater, is absolutely something near and dear to my heart, and I love that this character, together with Hal, so Bolaire, Hal, and then Brennan together, just being able to wax poetical about why theater and storytelling in such a medium means so much to us as a species. Um, and specifically, it's also truths that either are already true or truths that we want to be true and want to make seen in the world. The idea that, well, of course, like maybe they just need to be shown kindness and good will always triumph. We know, obviously, that is not always the truth of the events of our world, but if it's a truth we want to strive for and bring more into this world, then the fact of seeing something that lets us dream about a world where that is the case is incredibly important. And then because I was feeling so buoyed up by that and the hope of him saying, like, I think I'm going to choose to be kind, I was getting real, like, real excited for Belair, of like, wow, he's, like, gone through being used as a weapon this much and he's still choosing to be kind. And then we get the line, and first I'm gonna have to kill all these people in their sleep. I'm like, we do still get the Bolaire that we saw take his new body in the previous cold open during the overture. Just in case we forgot the sort of entity we were dealing with, where the action is generally considered not a good one, but you also understand that, like, the reason he knows he has to do this is because those people know what he is, and they're not going to let him walk free on his own. He's never going to be able to experience a free life, but conversely, so is never the guy that is now perpetually stuck underneath. It is very much an interesting dilemma. It was a lot easier to stomach when it was very clear that the person we saw Bolaire take over in the previous cold open was very clearly not a good guy. I think this was a scene Taliesin wanted to use to kind of show that, like, it's not always that simple with a character like this. We know Taliesin often likes to explore various nuances with his character concepts, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that pours out. Then we jump into the Seeker's Table proper, with the initial greetings and House Einfasen, which I felt promising for Einfasen's honesty at the moment that I was watching it, because again, as discussed last week, and I think it was pretty clear from the YouTube comments and then even the comments on my own video that a lot of people viewed the end of last episode very differently. Some people saying they saw a confirmation, absolutely, that it was one way, and me feeling very uncomfortable because I felt like we didn't have confirmation either way. And that uncertainty actually ends up purveying most of this episode, or purveying. Permeates? No, not permutation. Permeating the episode. Sorry, my brain and words sometimes. And then I have to, like, hats off to Brennan for how Aranessa navigated introducing Vaelus's situation to Einfasen, while respecting Vaelus and allowing her to be able to be there. And I remember being struck with the thought somewhere between that moment and a little bit later that, of course, obviously there's the stereotype of the DMPC that, like, follows the group and veers a bit too much on solving their problems for her, and is like the DM throwing in the build they never get to play, and it's too powerful and becomes too much of a main character. And generally, I don't see Aranessa as this. Like, I see Aranessa as sort of the answer to the DMPC, but also in some ways as the roleplay equivalent, in that in certain situations, specifically when it comes to the noble houses, Aranessa is a canny and capable individual when it comes to maneuvering and politicking, and can kind of step in to this group that, like, Julian has a similar background, but not as much social polish. And Taisha is so used to relying on the deference that's expected of either her family or her position that she's not the worst at talking, but she does sometimes presume too much. And then Octus often not being able to be himself and often not being received well when he is. And Valus, as somebody that doesn't necessarily particularly care how to politic in these situations, or at least has not been trained to now that she has to care. So Araness actually being useful to step in, because sometimes the DMPC, when it is useful, is patching a gap in the party's strengths and then fading into the background when it is not that situation, and also being a way that Brennan can feed lore, and most importantly, like, being key to the, like, reason that they are all there, where Aranessa is an escort mission. We saw in the Battle of the Taconis House that she is not useless in combat. She definitely has her own skills, but is not a battle-hardened warrior, and especially Julian's goal is getting her safely to a different position, which I think is just a really interesting way of navigating this. And of course, them being both such great players and such great friends with being able to navigate this. I think a lot of the horror stories you hear come when it is a DM prioritizing their own fun over the players, and just very much knowing that is not the attitude, a Critical Role, that they are a company and a play group that is very interested in making sure everybody has their fun and what can they do to set up each other first. And as you see, we have a lot of good, like, one-on-one roleplay moments with Aranessa, specifically from Taisha and Julian. We also have her very interesting dynamic with Octus and the tenuous one with Valus. We had the moment where Aranessa tells Julian to, like, send that letter, send it quickly, and immediately insist on the speaking with Einfasen right away. I had heard Brennan roll a dice and thought perhaps Aranessa had either clocked or suspected something. Though what is later revealed in the insight check was she didn't want him to have time to prepare his answers, like, with his, like, she wanted to talk to him before his ministers could basically coach him on saying anything. But we don't get to know the results of that conversation immediately. Instead, we follow the group into the keep with, I'm going to admit that bathhouse does absolutely sound awesome. And the funny moment of Octus finding an excuse to retreat so he's not there with the others, and also pointing out, I just loved, like, I can't take off these clothes, they're an illusion. Which is why for shape-shifting disguise-based characters, my favorite combination is the Changeling with Shiftweave, where you are not going to get caught on a dispel, or you're not going to read as under an illusion. Like, the magic item in your clothes will change, but you could just say, like, I've got special magic clothes, and I can change them into various outfits, see? And not raise too much suspicion with that, depending on which outfits you show off. But that's just me as somebody who likes playing Changeling and hasn't actually played too much with Disguise Self, now that I think about it, but I haven't quite played the social characters in that way yet, so just a little fun of how different mechanics can interact with different ways of being found out. I think my first moment of suspicion of House Einfasen was the moment where Julian hands his note to the knight and he doesn't go to the aviary right away. So I was starting to feel like, oh, got a little bit of egg on my face for being the one of, like, hey, maybe Einfasen actually is dealing straight at the very least. I did have a moment when the knight, like, handed it off to a minister that I thought it was possibly the ministers of House Einfasen conspiring behind Otto's back, but then we immediately get the clock of, like, oh no, they're in the room where the conversation is happening. It might still be possible, but as we saw later, Einfasen would have his own reasons for at least being suspicious, and therefore acting suspicious. We have the moment in the aviary, or the aerie where he's about to send out the birds, and very interesting thing, we get the wisdom save, so Julian isn't looking at his shadow, and the aerie keeper looks over his shoulder, tears in his eyes, and says the name Freya. Like, almost like he's seeing the ghost of someone possibly gone in Julian's shadow, which really makes me wonder what we are playing with Julian's shadow there, and the curse that he sort of incurred with that moment in Theosy. I'd seen speculation that perhaps when Matt takes his fighter subclass, he's going to go Echo Knight, and the shadow is going to play into that. I initially had been a little less convinced of that, just because I felt it felt in the moment more like something Brennan was introducing than something that had necessarily been pre-planned. But I did take a closer look at Matt's stats when they put up the sheet, and noticed that besides Dex, his highest stat is Con. And as someone who has played an Echo Knight before, the secondary stat of the Echo Knight is your Constitution. All of your Echo Knight features that need to key off of one of your ability scores key off your Constitution, including your Constitution determining the number of times you can basically give yourself an additional extra attack from your Echo's location, which on a Dex-based dual wielding build, because we did see that Julian does use his gauntlet as an offhanded weapon. I did play a dual wielding Dex-based Echo Knight, and just once you get high enough fighter levels to have an ungodly number of attacks, you've got Action Surge, and you've got your additional extra attack you can proc as an Echo Knight, which you can proc every time you take the attack action. So with an Action Surge, you can do it twice. You can go Nova and be an absolutely disgusting number of attacks, even as a 9th to 10th level fighter. And my DM did have to sit through a couple of boss fights where my character got scared enough to go Nova. Generally, I'm somebody that hoards resources, so I don't tend to blow them all on one turn, but there was a particularly notable combat where he genuinely scared both me and my character enough to push the Nova button, and I did end up critting twice in the number of attacks. So yeah, an Echo Knight with an ungodly number of attacks is a particularly fond build of mine. So I think I might be a little more inclined to believe that. I don't know if it will tie into the shadow or not. Con is also just a good thing to have stat-wise. In general, for a martial character, particularly one going a little more lightly armored and dex built, so that you at least have the HP to back it up. But seeing that even as a rogue, that, with the fighter rogue levels, that his 3 highest stats are dex, con, then charisma. Which also makes me think swashbuckler rogue, because he does seem to like going off on his own, but we got at least 2 more levels if he goes pure rogue from here before we know subclass, and we could potentially learn fighter subclass next level up, depending on how Matt levels Julian. We have the little scene in the bathhouse, the conversation with Taisha and Valus, kind of making the point where the pariah blades were never meant to kill all the gods. They were just for freeing the orcs from Asgra. And so it's the idea of, like, this whole new world order was not the orcs' plan, but that doesn't mean they don't feel what happened was justified based on how the Shapers reacted. Because again, we know Brennan's gone on record talking about the whole reason the Shapers' War happened was the other Shapers rallied their people to ride to defense of the god of war and evil, and portions of their people went, but wait, isn't him dying a good thing? And we also, in the conversation between Valus and Octus, learn a little bit more about the connection between Octus, Thiazi, and Thimble, which had been a question in my mind, seeing that he seemed to be a lot more familiar with Thimble than with Thiazi. We get confirmation of that, in that while for whatever reason, Thjazi was within the Draconis' homes at least twice, because it was once to see Octus and once to give him the spell book, and another time to convince his parents to go, unless he was there for an extended period of time, and all three of those things happened in the same visit. But that it was and Octus going on the line that he and Thimble became friends, though they had been less in contact once he was at the Pentevral. So it was just sort of understanding of like, yeah, there had been that sort of like distance, almost like a, not so much hero worship, but like this was somebody I looked up to without that sense of knowing them when he was sort of saying goodbye to Thjazi, versus the warmth that he and Thimble clearly had for each other. So it does sort of get it stated clearly that that was in fact what happened. We have the interesting role of him questioning if the Stone of Night Song was actually made of stone. He didn't roll high enough to seem to know really more about that. And Velus's insight check was more into the nature of it. And we did get told, I believe in the first or second episode, that it was actually like sort of the remains of, or a relic made from the Psychopomp Celestial. So I don't know if it's the equivalent of like celestial bone or even condensed celestial magic. But I think there is possibly a good chance that it's not made of stone, and what the implications are of that remain to be seen. And we have the kind of heartbreaking flashback to young Julian to, again, sort of have us mourn in retrospective a character we didn't know all that well, and perhaps, I don't want to say we saw in a bad light, because his reaction to Julian's state does make sense from his perspective. I sort of feel where I was when we were watching the Julian-Raymond dynamic before Raymond's death, was that these were two people that both needed to understand each other a little bit more, but Julian really did need to step up a bit more. So we get to see a slightly more simpler time of their dynamic. And I absolutely love the lesson before the dueling of like, okay, forget everything you learned about polite dueling. This is how you win a fight. And kind of proving why the difference between a fighter and a rogue is not that the rogue uses underhanded tactics. It's that the fighter uses the fighter uses all tactics. Kind of, again, making sense of why somebody who has actual war experience would have both fighter and rogue levels. Makes sense. You do what you have to survive and win. It doesn't matter if it's dirty if you come out alive. So I just sort of like that of just like, Raymond was probably a multi-class fighter rogue as well. You get that feeling. Or it could have just been all fighter, because he was less of a guerrilla tactics, although some of the things he was teaching Julian. We have the conversation between Aranessa and Taisha, and then Taisha and Einfasen, where now our Seeker's table knows not necessarily the full blanket of the full banquet ploy that we saw from the schemer's perspective, but we do at least now see them know what the party line is that Draconis threw out. And Aranessa bringing up the difference between omission and lying when it comes to how far they can trust Einfasen, which was a pretty good reminder, and sort of setting expectations for what to see going forward. Of, it's not that you have to distrust what he says, it's that you have to listen for what he does not say. And then Aranessa brings up some good questions about what the plan was, and that gets talked a little bit more in the group conversation when they're back together. So I think I'll save my point on like what Draconis' plan was on the attack on Palazzo Divinos. We had a really cool tidbit I don't remember hearing before or seeing in any of the art they've dropped, but I know I haven't seen probably all of the art they've dropped. Apparently Ahriman is a planet with rings. Because twice in this episode he points out the like planetary rings that can be seen in the night sky. And that's just cool. I love that. I don't know if there will ever be lore or if that is just background setting because that looks awesome. And I agree, it looks awesome, and I'm just happy that it exists whether or not it ever becomes relevant in the campaign. I just thought it was cool, and this was the first time I remember hearing it stated. Um, and then we get the conversation between Einfasen and Taisha, where it is more clear to the audience how unclear Einfasen's situation is. Where he is being told two different things by two different groups of people, and both of them is saying the other one is lying. So it becomes very clear that he's probably not conspiring, but because he doesn't know, he doesn't want to make the wrong choice, and the easiest thing for him to do is keep everybody in one place until he gets proof. But also, seeming again very clearly, as Taisha points out later, he's making sure that whichever path he takes doesn't piss off the druids, which means of the Sundered Houses, Einfasen is the clearest one not just playing lip service to the Circle of Ancients. Like, Aranessa has an obvious respect for Taisha and her way of, and her circle and the druidic tradition. But we don't see necessarily the pure level of deference, and obviously we've not really seen Aranessa in a political position, so we don't know if House Royce has the same level of deference to the druids that Einfasen very clearly has. To the point where it's not just a, like, these are important figures in our history. It's these are important figures in our politics now. And I want to know that whatever I do does not get them upset at me. It's very interesting, and then when we see the druids later, I have more thoughts connected to that. Then we get the group reconvening, kind of talking about what they've learned, what could possibly be going on. It's brought up that the banquet ploy may have been out of desperation because they didn't have time to come up with a better lie. Which again, if that's the case, what had been the plan? As they point out, it was very clearly declared aloud tonight, Houses Royce and Davino's fall. We do know that at least some of Aranessa's cousins are dead because we saw the bracers with the soldiers' table. And what none of the players brought up, and I still haven't watched the cooldown because I jumped right to recording this video, nobody knew that Octus was going to be at Palazzo Divinos before that morning. The dominoes of that, there was no way for that to be known or factored into their plans. The carriages had already been stopped. Einfasen had already been lied to. The carriages had already been stopped. They were discussing that in the same conversation where they decided to go find Octus and bring him to safety. So whatever the Taconuses were planning for the Palazzo, they were planning before they knew Octus was going to be there. Now, whether they were already planning to do something to Octus, and when he was in the same place, both plans got combined into one, that could be a very strong possibility, but still doesn't fully answer the question of, if the plan was to do something to Palazzo Divinos, bring it down, why didn't they have time to come up with a more believable lie? Or, here's my take on it. They don't feel like they have to. As Taisha pointed out, if they don't feel like there's anyone who's going to call them out on it, and then Octus, a couple of times, bringing up, like, we don't know the specific wording, and because the Seekers don't, what they don't know is it was basically phrased as, this is our farewell feast, we shall see you all again in Fairy, and doing one of those, like, letter of the law being read differently, or the letter of the message, knowing that Fairy is the afterlife for House Royce. Nowhere in that note did it say that the gates to Fairy reopened. Just that the Royces were there. And that could be the Taconuses' line. That still would be them having to admit what they'd done. So this reads to me as they just need to buy time until they feel it doesn't matter if people call them out on it. Which means they could be a lot closer to getting whatever they want from the Cairns up in Timony that the soldiers' table saw them going for than we perhaps want. Like, may not just be the schemers table that is running up to we got to this at the last minute. Because the Taconuses are not acting like people putting the first steps of long contemplated plans into action. They're acting like people that just need to knock over the last few dominoes and then everything's won. Which is intriguing and terrifying. But does make me wonder if we are trying to imply that the banquet was a scramble, what the plan was. And again, if it was, let's see House Royce fall. Aranessa is a known sorcerer and was casting spells before Octus's brother left the room. In fact, he dropped the silence while she was in the room to get the final taunt in. Like, that feels like they're underestimating a lady of a sundered house way too fucking much. And it can't be that they didn't expect her to be there because she was known to be there. It was her caravan coming through. And they also weren't acting in the, like, oh shit, there's a variable we didn't plan on. They didn't care. I've still got a lot of questions. And perhaps more than I thought I did before this episode about what was going on at the Palazzo. Also, I love Octus's arcane way of signing his work is to let an undead cat wreck the bedroom. Yeah. Cat's desire to knock things over plus the zoomies add undead and arcane magic to the mix. Yeah. That room's gonna take a long time to get clean. And then we sort of have Aranessa's little avatars from the past moment with like the female line of House Royce extending behind her. And we get a little bit of history to how the House Royce became connected with fairies in such a beautiful fairy tale thing of this young mortal girl somehow helped save the world of fairy, and so like her entire lineage is blessed with this connection to the fae, which is like straight out of folklore and the kind of stories that that is one I hope we learn a little bit more about. We don't need to know the details. I just like to know a little bit more about it. Like, maybe is this a fairy tale within the world of Ahriman? Like, maybe not necessarily even have to know the truth of what happened, but what is the story of what happened? And chalking up another quote to the I love Aranessa as the NPC, as after she verifies what Octus's letter was, so there will be some slight rudeness to our departure, and that will inform the tone of the letter that I am about to write. She is an escort mission, like, lady of nobility NPC that still has her own will, opinions, and attitude, and I love her. In a way that she does sometimes feel like the fifth, and like the way Brennan is balancing it, where she does sometimes feel like the fifth PC at the table without overshadowing any of the other PCs. So I'm very much enjoying it. Then we get the terrifying little tidbit of the vulture catching the pigeon much closer than Dolmakiar. My first thought was, oh, we've got conspirators closer. I first thought of Tyranny's sisters, and then I realized, wait, no, that's Halavar, not Taconis. Turns out I had sisters, right? Just wrong characters, sisters, as the creepy twins show up, and from Alex's reaction as Brennan was describing them, knew before the fun moment of, do you have sisters? Or do you have twin sisters? Why do you ask? Why do you think? Shit. Yeah, no, from Alex's reaction, it was just like, oh, the NPCs you helped create just showed up, and you're the one that goes, oh no, I know how bad those people are, because I wrote it in my backstory. And I'm 90% certain Bria clocked that from across the table and went, great, we are going to push that button as soon as I'm back. And then we get the group feather falling, landing near the horses, getting on their horses, and ending up at the Druid's Grove rather than chancing the Pulley Gate, which turns out, at least in the immediate moment, was the good choice because the pulley had just left thanks to Brennan rolling in front of the table. We get an interesting connection on the plinths and statues going up. He mentioned writing by the hands of giants on these stones. Which means we actually have a somewhat confirmed connection between the giants and the druids, which would make sense if the giants are connected to the primordials, or the titans. I can't remember which term Brennan used a couple episodes ago. And would also be a handy way of explaining why Einfossen is still so deferential to the druids, particularly the Circle of Stone, if the Circle of Stone in particular has a connection to giants, because we know Einfossen's own house is connected to giants, so the idea that there actually may have been a stronger druidic connection that perhaps had to be buried or not acknowledged or even not necessarily thought about or acted on during the time of the Shapers, but in the post-Shapers War, finding this connection, and that would explain why the druids have a little bit more of a political say in Riesengarten, at least when it comes to how Otto Einfossen reacted. Which would be very interesting. I love that my first reaction, when Brennan first went to describe the leopard, hadn't even described it, just like, there's a large, and he did like a yawn and stretch thing. My first thought was him describing / embodying Tempest at the first episode of Calamity. So I knew we were getting a big kitty, and sure enough, we got a big kitty with horns, and I cannot help the fact that my brain literally did go, kitty! As soon as he was like, yeah, it's a, 12-foot long spotted leopard. I'm like, I want to pet it. Because the nice thing is, if it's in a druid grove in a fantasy world, you actually probably could, with permission, probably even from the cat, pet the cat without fearing your arm getting bitten off, which is why I love the nature-based classes in fantasy. I'm an animal lover. If I can't get near them in real life, let me get near them in my play pretend. And speaking of just fun things to be introduced to in the world, the dwarf druid with the birdhouse in his beard. I absolutely love that. We'll probably steal that, and if any of my players somehow in any of the games I'm watching ever see this video, and shortly thereafter encounter a dwarven druid with a birdhouse in his beard, ask him about it. He'll be very happy to introduce you to his bird friends. I'll come up with a couple that live there. Absolutely. We get a little taste of world building with bringing up the different druidic circles. So we know the old path is the sort of the blanket term for all druidic circles, and then it seems they have their own specialties and focuses. We know the circle of ancients and the circle of, oh gosh, he named the one that was helping them heal. The Circle of Seasons was helping the Circle of Ancients in the healing of the Barodel. Circle of Stone is very obviously stone focused, like the earth, the mountains around them. Circle of the Hunt seems like a little bit more combative. And especially with the characters we see at the very end, the cliffhanger moment, kind of getting a little bit of the Council of Witches vibes from Worlds Beyond Number. The Witches Conclave in the third season, or the third arc of, or third chapter, I don't remember my terms, of The Wizard, the Witch, and the Wild One, where, for those a little bit less familiar, Brennan runs a podcast. Abria Iyengar, Lou Wilson, and Erika Ishii are his co-hosts. The Wizard, the Witch, and the Wild One is their D&D kind of fantasy campaign that Brennan was running. It's on a break now. Lou Wilson is running a sci-fi, and then Abria will be running a sci-fi piece. But Erika Ishii's character in The Wizard, the Witch, and the Wild One is the witch, and has sort of been joined into this council of other witches, and they each had their different domains. She was the Witch of the World's Heart. They were being hosted by the Witch of the Wind and Stars. there was both a very plant-based witch and a very animal-based witch, Hekea and Grimoire, respectively. And especially the character we get introduced to, that like when he takes off his helmet, we can see he's like partially made of tree and kind of torn up, but he also like has those claws. Like I was getting Grimoire vibes when he was described with his armor on, and then we had the like helmet come off, and I'm like, oh, that's if Grimoire and Hekea were the same character. Grimoire being the more animalistic, very violent one. I can't believe I'm blanking on her official term, because they all had W titles. Because there was World's Heart, Wind and Stars, Waning Moon. I keep wanting to say Reaching Green, but that's a spirit, not a witch. And here I was half starting this YouTube channel because I'm like, I want to bring in all the Wizard, the Witch, and the Wild One parallels, and I'm blanking on the titles of two of the witches. I remember their names. But so we have that character, which, given the similarities to those, is very interesting because Hekea ended up being sort of an allied figure, if ultimately with a saved Erica's character's life and then voted against her interests in the council. Meanwhile, Grimoire, like, viscerally slaughtered an NPC in Abria's character's canoe while she watched and could not do anything about it because of the rules of hospitality and how witches were, how they work in that world. So it's very interesting, like, oh, and Abria's facing them kind of both in the same person. That could be me projecting. We don't know anything about this individual's personality, nor about the other druid we were introduced to, who specifically was called out as a bear folk, which is our first confirmation that the Nama, the lion folk, are not the only humanoid animal races in Ahriman. That there are more types of beast folk than just the Nama, which means I mean, it makes sense. D&D does already have a couple of different humanoid animal races, several birds, between the Aarakocra, the Owlin, and the Kenku. You also have the Tabaxi in addition to the Leonin. Shifters aren't really an animal species. They're just werewolf-light. I say as somebody who's playing one now. And very obviously we can at least have NPCs that are different animal species than currently supported in D&D, like, mechanics, because they're NPCs, they don't need mechanics. We can have a bear folk. So I'd be interested in seeing what else is out there, and whether, again, kind of raising the questions I raised at the end of the Seeker's Table, is the seventh shaper. We don't know what the seventh race, the seventh shaper, was over. Was it all beast folk under one shaper? Or was the seventh shaper a different race and the beast folk are actually outside of the shapers? Which, given some of Teor's flashbacks, to me actually seems more likely. Especially also given that we have this sort of like druidic connection with nature having been suppressed during the shapers era. But yeah, so that remains to be seen. Although, presumably, the next question that will be addressed before any of these is, how on earth you gonna get out of this one, guys? How good's your charisma, Taisha? What can you lean on when your I'm a druid card doesn't work because everyone in that conversation is a druid? But yeah, absolutely fascinated to see how that turns out, and yeah, I'll be as quick as I can with the next video after that one, but I hope you all have a wonderful week and are staying warm if it is currently colder temperatures where you are, or staying cool if you're in our opposite hemisphere right now. But yeah, bye y'all.